People expect you to live life in a certain way. So if you're a sheikh, okay, they probably get up and just read all day.
Your phone, that's your mambara now. That created kind of a disconnect from a young boy. He doesn't feel like the scholar understands what he's going through.
This is just my humble opinion. I'm sure there's people out there who might disagree, but
Oh, really?
another thing you'll hear people say a lot is,
God is out there to choke them in their sleep. You're gonna hang from your hair in hell because you don't wear a scarf.
and I think one of the biggest misunderstandings people have is that God expects you and I to be perfect. Whereas when you go and look into the verses of the Quran, he's expecting you to try.
What's one piece of information that you learned in Hawza that surprised you?
You're sitting in class and the teachers will oh, well, this is not wajib, or this is haram, for example. And you're like, but...
I would die to know what is it wajib.
I only want to learn about the not wajib one, not the other one.
You're depressed, go read Quran. Obviously that doesn't work like that.
Like when your hand breaks, if you want to recite Surah Al-Fatiha on your hand, sure. But then you also have to go to the hospital and get it done.
What are the most common thing people are struggling with?
I don't know why our Muslim community is so behind on this. Every other minority understands this,
Before we start today's episode, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time out of your day and giving this podcast to listen. And I also wanted to remind you that the only way this podcast will ever grow is with your support and with your help. So subscribe to the podcast, like this video, and now let's get the show started.
Welcome aboard Middle East Airlines.
والمتوجهة إلى طيران الشرق الأوسط يرحب مدينة القدس العربية.
Sheikh Mahdi, how are you?
Doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming. I want you to introduce yourself, but I want you to introduce yourself not as how everyone would know Sheikh Mahdi, but when Sheikh Mahdi looks in the mirror, who is Sheikh Mahdi to Sheikh Mahdi?
Sure. So I don't know the questions were going to be this deep from the very beginning. But yeah, I think, so I'll just go a quick background. So I grew up here in the States, and just going through school, and I had a little bit of a different experience growing up because I grew up here and then our family moved to Iran at a really young age. So I was there for a while, and then I kind of got into the Hawza system and went through the studies. And so here I am now, mainly right now my time is dedicated to lecturing, classes, workshops, and things around like Islamic content, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how did you end up here in the first place? Or how did your family move to America?
Yeah, so I was born in North Carolina.
Okay.
My family had moved here. My mother and father had moved here a lot earlier than that as students.
Okay.
So they were studying here, and they were based in North Carolina, and that's when I was born. I think around 5 or 6 maybe. My father was very particular about us getting Islamic education and going to Islamic school. So because of that, he essentially moved us to Maryland.
Okay.
Where there is an Islamic school, a little bit bigger community, and so on and so forth. So from that point, we started living in Maryland. I was there until 5th grade-ish. And then around that time, my family decided to move back to Iran. So we moved back. I did middle school and high school in Iran.
Okay.
Which was a very, interesting experience. In some ways difficult, because it was a complete 180 from what you're used to over here.
How does it differ?
Well, I think it's just less pampered.
Okay.
People are, when you go back home, a lot of times you feel like you start to realize the comfort we have over here,
Right.
and the convenience that life offers over here. Then you go back and you see how your relatives live, and it's just different. And then when you go to the schooling system, that's to another extent, because you're actually in the thick of what a typical, in my case, Iranian child would go through growing up,
Right.
So that was a very interesting experience. After that, I was right around end of high school, I started in the Hawza.
Okay.
So started there. So we moved to Qom, which is where, in Iran, typically you're going to go to Qom. Mashhad has like a smaller Hawza, but typically it's Qom where people go. And so I was there for about 10 years in the Hawza. And then around 2016, 2017, I think we moved back to the States eventually.
When you move back and forth like that, do you feel more connected to here, or do you feel more connected to back home in Iran?
I think my experience was a bit unique. It's a little bit of both. There was actually a 3-4 year stretch where we hadn't fully moved over there. So I was doing 1 year of school there, and then we would fly over here, do a year of school here, and then go back there the next year. So, my childhood is a little different from, the typical, you just grow up in one place and you stay there and so on and so forth, But I think it gave me a really good experience of being able to see life from like different perspectives.
Right.
And I think it's a really valuable experience.
What was the main difference in perspective between living here and living there?
I think you just come to appreciate the opportunities, that life offers here. Mm-hmm. You come to appreciate it a lot more. Yeah. When you're born here and that's just the default, you're like, okay, well, this is just how life is. When you start traveling or you grow up somewhere else, then you come here, you're like, oh no, this is not always the case, you know? So I think that was the main difference for me.
Okay. And is that what you wanted to be since you were a young kid? Or did you have any dreams or aspirations before actually going to the Hawza?
I don't know how or why, but from a really young age, I was just really drawn to it. My father was very, very encouraging of it. So that was very obvious. Anytime guests used to come over to the house, my father was always implying that, Mahdi wants to become he wants to go to the Hawza and everything. He never forced us or anything like that, but it was very clear he really wanted this. Yeah. And I had 2 older brothers who also went into the Hawza. Okay. So I think that had a really big impact on me. And I think I was 15, immediately when I was done with high school. For some reason, I don't know why, but I knew for sure this is what I want. Nothing else was even an option for me at that point. Yeah. It's kind of odd when I think about it back now because, when you're 16, you still don't know much about...
You're a baby, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but I don't know. In my mind, it was like, no, this is what I want to do. Yeah. So, I actually remember the last year of high school, 2 of my other buddies, we got together and we're like, hey, we're all going to go to the same school. Because, the Hawza has different schools, right? It's all under the same umbrella, but they have different schools. So we all got together and we're like, we're going to go to the same school. And we all applied together. We all got in together and,
there's an application process?
There is. It's probably not as, as difficult to get in as med school or whatever the case might be. But there's an in-person interview. There's a written exam that they take as well. And it also depends on the school you're going to. Okay. So some schools are a little bit more, flexible in terms of who they take in. Some schools are more specific. Okay. Okay, are we going to take in this guy or not, and so on and so forth. So I studied in a school called Shahidain Islamic Seminary. So it was a really, really well-run school. Yeah. Alhamdulillah, yeah.
That's good. And so the way I think about it is when you're a sheikh in Iran, you it's probably very normal to see sheikh walking in the streets of Iran, but when you're walking in the streets of Maryland or North Carolina, or even now in Texas, that's where you're based now. Yeah. And I don't think it's as normal. Mm-hmm. So how has that kind of translated into your life here?
Well, typically on the, just on the streets, I'm not wearing the libas, right? So I don't have that same experience here. But I think regardless of where you are a sheikh, there's certain expectations that people have or people expect you to live life in a certain way, right? Like there's this almost like a cookie cutter type of stereotype, right? That like, okay, so if you're a sheikh, that means this is what your life looks like, right?
What's that stereotype?
I mean, I'm
like?
assuming for the average person, it revolves mostly about like living a very boring life.
Yeah.
So you know, like, okay, they probably get up and just read all day,
Yeah.
you know, stuff like that. But, and you know, the different people are different, right? So like, I have some friends that's literally what they do. They wake up and they're just like, okay, well, you know, they might attend a couple classes, come back home, have like discussions, and then, you know, they'll write papers and stuff like that. But the house is very, you know, I think it's far more diverse than the average person appreciates. Like you'll have all sorts of like all walks of life who will come into the Hawza,
Yeah.
right? Now, of course, we're living here, so we're not exposed to every person who goes through it.
Right.
But yeah, I think a lot of people assume that if you're a sheikh, you know, like it's a very dry life. I think that's what most people assume. And in reality, it may not necessarily be like that at all.
How does that look like?
The dryness?
Let me put it like this. You said there's a stereotype to how people see sheikh, like it's dry and all that. But how is it actually like?
Yeah, I mean, it just depends on the person's character, right?
So like someone like you, for example.
I mean, so like like with the work I'm involved in, right? So I'm primarily involved in 2-3 main initiatives in Texas, right? So my day kind of revolves around those 2-3 things mainly, right? So there's an Islamic center that we founded along with a number of other brothers and sisters. It's called City of Knowledge, based in Dallas, Texas.
Okay.
And then there's also Mizan Institute that Sheikh Mahdi Rastani, he founded, and I play more of like a supportive role.
Okay.
So City of Knowledge is basically your center, but it's mostly like a youth-oriented center.
Okay.
More like forward thinking and so on and so forth, catering more to families and youth. And then Mizan Institute was founded mainly because there's like a severe lack of Islamic knowledge in our communities.
Right.
Especially when you're talking about deeper Islamic knowledge, right? Like there's a certain level of Islamic knowledge that's very ubiquitous. Like everyone will come across it, right? But then deeper questions come up and you'll find the average person will struggle, you know? And so my day basically revolves a lot around that. Like the community side of it is very, it's anything but boring, you know? Because it's like, you're dealing with community members. So this person might come in, maybe they want to get married, or God forbid, you know, they want to go get a divorce. You know, it's like 180-degree spectrum. And then you have to like plan and strategize for what the future of the community, what you would want it to look like.
Right.
And then questions that people have. And then, there is a portion of it that's preparing for lectures and stuff. So then you sit down. But even that, if you're passionate about it, it's never going to come across as like boring, right? Because like it's actually, for me, lectures are an opportunity to basically take a question that I've been asked probably like 10-15 times and build a talk around it. Yeah, you know. And so I always think about lectures in the terms of like in the thinking of this person, there's like a knot somewhere, right? And they're struggling with it, and with this lecture, I'm trying to do, I might sound it more complicated than it is, but I'm trying to like do a little bit of a surgery and untie that knot in their mind. So later when they come to this topic, it's clear. You know, they don't feel that the difficulty in understanding that topic. So like when you look at it that way, like, you know, it's actually very interesting, right? You know, because you're like, okay, so what are the questions this person is struggling with? What analogy can I use to explain it in the best way? Sometimes you have to go read up on the topic for hours and hours. Sometimes you have to put in time in terms of like, okay, how do I want to organize the talk? So all of that kind of stuff comes up. And then Mizan Institute also does a lot of like workshops. And so a big part of that is a lot of traveling. Okay. And so traveling has, you know, it's pretty clear how interesting traveling can be.
Yeah. Especially meeting people of different communities.
Yeah, different communities, different backgrounds. Again, when you visit a community, every interaction is like a different question, concern, story that people share with you, right? And that happens a lot. Like people will come up to me and be like, oh, I was listening to this content, for example, right? And either they'll have another question about it, or, oh, you address this well, can you also address this concern? Or they just share a story with you. Like, you know, oh, this played a big role in my life, you know, like, so it's a very interesting experience.
Do you feel any type of pressure? Because I would think that just a regular person taking advice, if I'm going to my friend for advice, he might give me a piece of advice. It might work. It might not. There's probably like very little guilt involved in it. But with the work that you do, when it comes to religion, very sensitive topics come up. Do you feel pressure when someone comes and tells you, like, you're dealing with this all day? This is not one time where someone's going to come for religious advice. It's every single day. And you have to make sure that the information you're giving them is solid, because a lot of the times people don't go to sheikhs as much as they used to. And so, like, if I have an interaction with you and you told me something, I'm probably going to go tell other people, like, oh, the sheikh told me this, the sheikh told me that. You know, so there is you're not just telling one person that, you're telling a big group of people that. So how's that pressure like?
I mean, I think it's a couple things. So first of all, that's why sometimes when people come with questions that seem very simple, that's why I will, you know, sometimes it might take a week for me to get back to them. It's not always because I'm, you know, it's just busy. It's also because this simple question that you asked, I have to probably go and verify, you know? Yeah, you can, you know, there in any field, there are people who might just wing it, right? And just be like, hey, do this or do that. But like you said, in our field, you can't do that, you know? And so, so that's one thing, is like sometimes you have to take time out to just go and like look into like the different scenarios. And then, you know, sometimes people will send in questions and like it's not very specific, right? So like you're like, okay, well, now I have to get on the phone with this person and see like what's the particular situation they're dealing with. That's one thing. I think the other thing that I have become accustomed to doing and has helped me a lot in relieving this pressure is I let people know, or at least I try as much as I can to let people know if I'm not sure about something. Okay. So that's a little different from telling people you don't know. Right? So that's one thing. You just tell someone you don't know. Then there are things that like you're pretty sure about, but you're not 100% sure about. Right? So I just try to be very open about that. Right? So like if someone comes to me and says, hey, have you heard this narration before? Right? And it's a narration that's not very, like we haven't heard it too often. Typically my answer will be like, I haven't heard this narration, but it could be out there. Or I'll tell them, like, they'll be like, hey, is this opinion true? I'll say, well, I'm not 100% sure, but I think it is, you know?
When you say that, the first thing that came to my mind is people have egos. And when you talk about religious figures in particular, there tends to be a lot of the times people put them on a higher pedestal. You know, these are the people that quote unquote don't make mistakes. These people are the closest to God. So, and I want to assume that sometimes it gets in their head, and ego is a big problem. So telling someone that you're not sure of something takes, like, it's basically you have to put your ego aside and be like, I'm not sure. I haven't heard this.
I mean, like when you go through the Hawza, if you're paying attention to what your teachers are, number one, doing, and number two, teaching, they will ideally emphasize this stuff while you're going through the Hawza. Like, this is actually why the in-person interactions in the Hawza are so valuable. You know, now we're moving towards a day and age where the content in the Hawza and the books in the Hawza and so on, a lot of this is available online and otherwise, you know. And God knows only what AI is going to do, you know. But that's probably never going to replace the in-person interactions that you have with teachers who are well trained, not just like religious in terms of their religious knowledge, but also in terms of their akhlaq. And that's very, very important. So I remember when we were going to the Hawza, this is probably like my first or second year in the Hawza, right? And you're kind of like the rookie, right?
Yeah.
So there's senior students, and then there's senior scholars, right? So the senior scholars come in, even the senior students are like, so they look up to them so much and everything like that. And so sometimes you would observe from afar some of the small things they did, right? And one of them was this. Like if they didn't know something, they'd just be open about it. Like, I don't know about this, right? Or I remember we had one teacher who used to come and visit the school, and he basically had a lesson of akhlaq, right? So basically it was just like a weekly reminder of, the proper type of characteristics that we need to incorporate. And in the middle of the akhlaq class, like he would break down crying, right? Because of like the humility he felt, right? So he would talk about like, God has blessed us so much, and we're so in debt to God, right? And then like he would start breaking down and crying in the akhlaq class, right? So like the stories we hear of like sometimes scholars in the middle of the night crying, like this was a scholar who would just naturally would happen, and he would try to like gather himself and continue. But these types of things are those things that I think are very, very unique blessings of having the opportunity to study in person,
Right.
and with senior scholars who are like maybe 30 years ahead of you, and they'll tell you, listen, the knowledge is really important, but without akhlaq, like it's not even gonna have the effect that it's gonna have, neither on other people nor on yourself.
Right.
So yeah, setting this aside, the akhlaq thing is like, that's key.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that.
How do you know if you're qualified to be a scholar in the first place?
I get asked this question very frequently recently, and it's a little difficult to have like a very fine line. But what I would say definitely is, if someone, this is just my humble opinion, I'm sure there's people out there who might disagree, but if you're going to go speak on the mimbar, then I think Hawza studies have to be a must. Okay. Now that someone might say, well, this is a professor, they've studied in the university and everything. Sure. Yeah, absolutely. They write books, they write papers, they give lectures and so on and so forth. I feel like the mimbar is something that originated from a more religious, background. It didn't necessarily come from the university background, right? It came from that traditional background. And if you go back in history, you would see that fundamentally it's someone who studied in the Hawza who's sitting on the mimbar and speaking from the mimbar.
Yeah.
So I think that's really, really important. When you go through the Hawza, the first couple years is a lot of introductory studies. Right? I don't want to say basic because they're actually very crucial. But you don't really get to the meat of the discussions until well into your like third, fourth, fifth year.
Yeah.
So for me personally, like 4 or 5 years of studies is like an absolute must. And I do understand nowadays where we have like so many different communities, they look for speakers and so on and so forth. And so they come across people who may have not studied in the Hawza, right? So that presents a dilemma, and I have thoughts on that as well. But I think that's the first qualification. And then secondly is the akhlaq thing that we talked about. Like if you go back, none of our scholars were ever people of just knowledge, right? One person that I personally I'm very fond of, as well as I'm sure hundreds of other people and thousands of other people, is Allama Tabatabai, right? The author of Al-Mizan. And so he, you look into his life, a man of absolute knowledge, but then a man of like absolute akhlaq at the same time. So I think those two qualifications, to summarize it, I think those two are also always needed if someone wants to occupy the space on the mimbar that once we believe historically belonged to the Prophet.
Yeah.
And at one point to Ali ibn Abi Talib, and maybe very, very small times in history of the other imams, but mainly, these two holy characters. But yeah, I think those two mainly.
What is the hardest thing that you faced while studying in Hawza?
I don't think it was so much of a struggle. I think it was mainly like a challenge. What that was for me personally was, so the Hawza essentially teaches one to become like a scholar who can do research, who can write books, so on and so forth. Typically, the Hawza doesn't prepare you necessarily for becoming a speaker, right? That's not what the Hawza is mainly built for, right? And that's, there's a lot of organizations who are trying to, address that need and so on, because there's such a severe demand and need for it, in our communities. But I think that one of the biggest challenge that kind of became my calling in this path was, how do we take the deep knowledge that these great scholars of ours spent years and years of their life extracting from Quran and Hadith? How can I take that and make it digestible and simple enough that maybe a 15-year-old can sit down and listen? I present deep content to him while he's not feeling like, oh, this is like something I don't even have an idea of what he's saying, right? That kind of became my, my calling, right? So I felt that challenge going through Hawza, because you come across these books and like, some of the hadith books or some of the works of the scholars is like 15 volumes, 20 volumes. But you can't just like translate that and put that in front of the average person.
Of course.
Right? They're gonna be overwhelmed. Like,
years
what is
worth
this?
of studying and writing.
Exactly. So that I kind of saw that as my calling of like, okay, so how do I take that information and that knowledge that someone else sacrificed their whole life for, the stories of these scholars are like, crazy stories, like in terms of the sacrifice. How can I take that and make that digestible so that the average person can sit and listen and feel like their knowledge is increasing, without them feeling like it's too complicated? Yeah, so that was always a challenge. So I remember always sitting through the classes we had in the Hawza and always thinking to myself, okay, so this content that the teacher is teaching on like Islamic philosophy, for example, how can I take this and simplify it so that it can answer a question that maybe a 20-year-old has on this topic? So that kind of became like,
Did you feel a lot of other colleagues were paying attention to that too, that has become a need and they have to do that? I
think it just depends, again, like what your passion is. Like everyone who goes into the Hawza goes in for different reasons. Some people go in for research, some people go in to write books, right? So, and then some people go in because their end goal is, I want to be the person in touch with the community explaining these things. So yeah, if you're passionate about that, then that's how you're going to look at things. It's definitely not everyone. And I think just in general, the Hawza and the number of people who go in who can speak the language and understand the culture of our communities here, it's obviously not even close to what it needs to be, numbers wise.
You think we need more people going to Hawza?
Oh, definitely. So, maybe 10 years ago, because I wasn't so much in touch with the communities here and I hadn't moved here, it wasn't so obvious to me. Right now, it's clear as day that plays a direct role in a lot of the other issues we find in our communities. A lot of the issues we have in our communities, if you go down to the root cause, goes back to, a lack of deep Islamic education. So yeah, you need more manpower for that.
What's one piece of information that you learned in Hawza that surprised you? You were like, whoa.
I had that experience multiple times.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Multiple times. Anyone who goes to the Hawza, or most people, I won't generalize, but most people who go through the Hawza, they already have a general understanding of like some Islamic concepts. So you kind of go in thinking like, all right, well, I already know like most of the basics, right? Where's the deeper stuff, right? And one of the experiences I had on multiple occasions is like realizing something that you thought your whole life was actually wrong.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That's like a very common experience. I remember sitting through our Islamic philosophy class, and the teacher said something. The teacher mentioned like this philosophical rule, right, from the book of Allama Tabatabai. And the moment I heard it initially, I thought to myself, there's no way that's true, right?
Do you still remember what it was?
I do.
What is it?
I do. So it's a discussion in Nihayatul Hikmah of Allama Tabatabai about how, when someone gains knowledge, the soul and knowledge become one. Okay. Now it sounds very poetic, but this is not a class of poetry. This is a class of philosophy. So you got to prove it.
Yeah.
That's what philosophy is all about, right? So I heard that initially, and I was like, so you're telling me I've become one with knowledge? Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? It literally took like 10, 15 minutes of explanation from the teacher. And I was shocked because I was like, not only is he right, that's the only possible option. Nothing else is possible, right? It's a longer discussion in Islamic philosophy. But essentially, they talk about how the soul is not material and knowledge is not material. So if your soul, quote unquote, gains knowledge, essentially it's become one with the knowledge.
So that knowledge never leaves your soul?
So that knowledge is part of your soul, essentially. It essentially, when you learn something, you technically become a slightly different person.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not like you're there and then knowledge is just something that's sitting beside you, right? So it's a longer discussion, of course. But that experience I had multiple times, because it might have been like a fiqh rule that like growing up we were always taught, right? And then like you're sitting in class and the teachers will like, oh, well, this is not wajib or this is haram, for example. And you're like, but our whole life we were told otherwise.
I would die to know what is it wajib, and we thought it was wajib.
You only want to learn about the not wajib one, not the other one. Yeah, I mean, I that one I don't remember in particular, but like a lot of misconceptions that people have about like detailed rulings and so on and so forth, or just in general like how Islam approaches a particular topic.
Yeah.
So when you learn deeper, as I think you do with any topic in any like field, you start to realize, oh, it's not really like this way, it's that way, right? Yeah. So I had that experience. I think anyone who goes to Hawza has that experience.
Yeah. And you said that we need more people to go into Hawza because we're in need of people with this knowledge. If someone growing up is like 15, 16, in their late teens, early 20s,
yeah,
how do I know if that is a path for me?
Yeah. So firstly, the most important thing is, just like any other field, you have to figure out if this is really your passion. There's people who might read a couple books and they'll feel passionate about Islamic knowledge, but that's different from being passionate about being an alim. These two are different. Like you can gain Islamic knowledge by like listening to lectures, podcasts, reading books, and so on and so forth. It doesn't necessarily mean you're passionate about being an alim being your like career or your whole life.
Right.
But if someone does reach that point where they feel like, yeah, this is something I'm really passionate about, what I always like suggest to people is to do like maybe like a year or two. And there's already some pre-Hawza programs in the United States, some in Canada. So it kind of gives you a little bit of a feel. There's programs that, you travel to Iran or Iraq for like a summer. And so you have some classes and stuff like that. So that'll give you a taste, right? And then you'll be able to gauge like, is this something I want to do or not?
You mentioned that the Mumbar was a place that the Prophet, peace be upon him, stood on and spoke to people.
Yeah.
And throughout history, that's how the scholars got their point to the people. One of my friends said this. He said, back then, the only way to communicate with people was through the Mumbar. It was the highest point. It was like a high point where there was it was easy to maybe communicate to a larger group of people. It's not the case anymore, though. The best way to get through to people is through your phone. That's how people are, like, that's your Mumbar now, quote unquote. That's your Mumbar. That's how you're going to get to the youth. That's how you're going to connect with these people. But there is a lack and sheikhs don't know anything in general about pop culture, about this advancements in technology. And I get it, maybe like they have their studies like they're focused on, they can't be on their phones all day, but that created kind of a disconnect from a young boy and the religion, because he can't go to the scholar with a certain problem. He doesn't feel like the scholar understands what he's going through.
Sure.
So how did you see that?
I think so. First of all, like I think the mediums to reach the masses, or our communities, essentially, they always change from time to time. I don't think the phone has been the only scenario. Having said that, I think the minbar will always have its position, right? So the minbar has, over the past 1,400 years. It's had that solidified position. I don't think that's going to go anywhere anytime soon. But yeah, like one of those mediums is, of course, social media. And it's social media mainly as a, I think it's not so much just about social media. It's also about like just understanding where someone's coming from, right? And I think that's just a matter of making an effort. And also it makes a big difference if you're from this culture. Right. So I think sometimes scholars who might struggle a little bit with this is maybe because they weren't necessarily from this culture, But does that make a big difference? Absolutely. It makes a huge difference. And I always tell, some of the younger guys that I'm in touch with, I always tell them, I'm like, you guys are lucky because now we have all these, English speakers and, people coming in. When we were growing up, it was a very respected alim, who used to come, but like in our community, this person was speaking Farsi.
Yeah.
Right? I'm sure in your community it's Arabic, and of course Arabic still continues to this day. But so we didn't understand like 60% of what he was saying. Usually you had some uncle from the community who was like taking notes and then would read the translation out to you.
Oh, wow.
Right? Yeah. So he would talk for like 10 minutes. And then the uncle will be like, okay, now pause. So Maulana is saying this, and that, for like 5 minutes. And then pause and then go back to him. Obviously, that's not efficient at all, But I think that's definitely one of the struggles of the Hawza a little bit in general. But then, people who come out of the Hawza, it's something we have to make an effort with regards to. That's on that side. I think on the other side, we need to have a deeper discussion around, if there is a person who has knowledge to offer. I think if there's more of that thirst built into our youth, then they can also get along a little bit better with some of these obstacles, right? So maybe the guy's not the most like, comfortable person to speak to, right?
Right.
Okay, but if you're really thirsty to learn something, then maybe you can compromise on certain things. I know that may not work for like a 15-year-old, right? But when you get older and you become a little bit more mature in life, then you're like, well, these are the options I have, right? So let me also make an effort to try to ask and try to inquire more. Sometimes I visit communities and you'll see the youth are just like, this is rare, but it happens sometimes where the youth are just very distant, right? And so I feel like now we've reached a point where like the dominant culture is expecting like the alim to really go out of his way and like, essentially approach the kids and like, and I think the alim should be open, and then the demand should come from, the youth and the kids. So I think it's a little bit on both sides that needs addressing.
I absolutely agree. And I wanted to ask, how do you, because you're one sheikh that I listen to, that it's evident that you do understand what's happening in the culture. So how hard is it really to take care of your Islamic studies, obviously, and do your research and give your classes at the same time, acquire this very rapid technology advancements that we've been having?
I mean, I think it comes more naturally to some people than others. For me, it's just, I think it just comes very naturally, to be very honest. It's not something, like if I wasn't an alim, I don't think my life would be too different anyways, you know. But yeah, I think it's the times are definitely changing. I think the most important thing is being understanding of where this 13-year-old or 15-year-old or 17-year-old is coming from. Like just having a clear understanding of like their challenges, right? And that's really how a lot of the lectures, or at least the topics that I choose, are built around that. Like I literally sit and think a little bit from the questions I've gotten over the years, but then I also sit and think of like, okay, if I'm 15 and I'm trying to practice my faith, what does life look like, you know? And what are those struggles that I have? And then a lot of times you'll have parents who will come and share these things, especially if you're working with a community. Like this is every single day. Like I get messages every single day from parents who are struggling with different things.
What are the most common thing people are struggling with?
I think the most common struggles is, and this could have hundreds of different factors, right? But I think the most common thing is you'll find parents who are dealing with kids at like elementary age level, and they're fine. You know, like at that age, 7, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you know, their expectation is very minimal of the kid because naturally he's a kid. And okay, come to the majlis with us, sure. You know, let's go pray together. Let's go do this together. Everything is fine, right? Then they start hitting middle school, late middle school, early high school. I mean, it's the teens years anyway. So it's tumultuous anyways. Yeah. And then throw in pressure from your family to practice your faith. And on the other side, pressure from everything else in society telling you that you're weird, you're backwards, you're acting odd, you're dressing differently, all of that, right? So what I get a lot of is families who, when their kids were younger, they were like good kids, you know, whatever that means, right? But the moment they hit like, puberty or beyond that, now all of a sudden he doesn't want to pray, right? He doesn't want to fast. He's not listening anymore. And I think a lot of that, and this was one of the things I think we addressed in like one of the lectures I did recently, was on the education that we do for our kids. Like we are absolutely lacking in that area. And I feel like we need to invest a lot more because it's not a coincidence. Like a lot of people think it might be just a coincidence.
Because we're living in America and like that's how it is here.
Yeah. And so it's not a coincidence. Like this is a very predictable thing. Okay. Like if the understanding of my child of his faith is just like a very superficial, basic understanding, that like we kind of do this cultural stuff and, you know, like people have Christmas and then we have Eid, for example, you know, like at that level, of course, when my child grows up, he's going to start, first of all, questioning everything. And secondly, he's going to feel weird, like doing things differently from everybody else, right? So the way you do that is you build a proper atmosphere around your child, and you place your child in situations with friends, with mentors, with people to look up to who do have the values that you want your child to have. I don't know why our Muslim community is so behind on this. Every other minority understands this. Every other minority, you know, like the Jewish community, right? You have to give them credit. Like they've done such a good job with this.
Yeah.
They're so understanding of the idea that like we have certain values. So we're going to put our children in positions where those values become the norms for them. And there's a lot of things that people will come back to you with, right? Like they'll say, this is one of the most common ones I've ever heard. Well, Sheikh, my children is going to be exposed to XYZ anyways. So he might as well be exposed to this when he's at school. And I'm like, no, your child is like 10, 11. These are like years where his whole atmosphere is being built. His character is being built. Inshallah, when he's 18, 19, 20, him and you yourself will be exposed to millions of other things that you never thought were possible.
Right.
But you don't expose the child at such a young age, and not just exposing and making it the norm for the child. Yeah. You know, if it's like once or twice, it's not a big deal. But every day this child is going to a school where people are dressing a certain way, people are listening to certain things, people are watching certain things. And then every day you're telling this child, no, this past 8 hours of your life,
You got to remove it.
you got to remove it. This is not what we do. This is not what we believe in. This is not the likelihood of my child sticking to his faith really goes down. Another thing you'll hear very often is, I'm very passionate about this stuff.
Go ahead.
Another thing you'll hear people say a lot is, oh, well, I know so-and-so's child who went through this system. Maybe they didn't do this for their education and so on and so forth. And they turned out fine. And it's very much a lack of understanding of likelihood, right? Like, we're not saying that if you don't attend to the education of your child, that he's definitely going to lose all of his faith. No, that's not the claim.
But there's a higher chance.
The chances go higher, right? It's like putting on a seatbelt, right? Like, can you, God forbid, lose your life with a seatbelt on? Yes, absolutely. Does the likelihood go down? Yes, very much, you know? So you get that all the time too. Like, people are like, well, I didn't go to this school, but I turned out fine.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, how did your classmates turn out? You know, like, it's not a matter of one or two people. It's a matter of giving your child the best chance and opportunity to succeed. Yes, there's no guarantees. You know, the son of Noor became the son of Noor, got into the Quran for the wrong reasons, got famous for the wrong reasons. So that's always a thing. But I think we need to invest in the education of our younger generation. And that was before, you know, some of these other issues popped up and, you know, with the changing sexual norms and stuff like that. With that stuff, I think a lot more parents are starting to realize that, oh, yeah, they will expose my child to pretty much anything at this point.
So you give the parents what they should have done. What you just said is what they should have done. They should have built that kind of a close community for them at a young age. But when they're reaching out to you, when their kid is already going out and partying and not praying and not fasting, and they're reaching out to get like a tangible solution, what do you tell the parents?
I mean, honestly, it just comes down to whatever foundation they've already built. Sometimes there's zero foundation, and so there's really not much you can do because this person, this young brother or sister is just like, don't talk to me. Like, I don't even want to have it, right? Well, your parents want you to sit down with alim and discuss, and they're like, so that what happens, you know? So sometimes it's that, sometimes no, they have a foundation, and so they have questions, concerns. You know, I remember a mother once called me in the middle of a program I was doing, in the middle of a lecture I was doing. I got like 5 missed calls on the phone, right? So I was very surprised. And so afterwards, she was on the phone and, you know, she was crying, you know, and she was like, you know, my child is losing his faith and, you know, I don't know what to do and all of that kind of stuff. So I said, well, is he willing to sit down so we can talk? Because she mentioned that he's asking a lot of questions that we don't even have the answers to. So I said, well, is he willing to sit down and talk and everything? And they were like, yeah, he's willing to sit down and talk. And, you know, he's been to some of your talks before and he kind of enjoyed it and stuff like that. So I was like, sure, you know, let's sit down and talk. So I sat down with him and had a conversation with him. Took maybe an hour. I remember vividly that after I was done, then his, you know, one of his relatives who had come with him was like, okay, we're going to head out. And then he told the relative, why don't you go? I want to ask some more questions just privately with Sheikh and have a couple more questions to ask. So he asked those, you know, extra questions and stuff like that. And I didn't think too much of it. I just thought, you know, it's a conversation. And so time passed, and I remember having conversations with him later, like a year later. And he was like, well, those conversations, some of them, essentially the tie I was talking about before, like the knot I was talking about before, like for him, they brought clarity to him.
Okay.
And so he was like, a lot of religion started to make more sense to me, you know? And now, like, he's, you know, very much practicing and into his faith and volunteering and so on and so forth, you know? So, but that's a family who built at least some foundation, you know, with the child. So yeah, it really ends up being a matter of like sitting down with them, having a conversation. Sometimes it's family issues in the house. Sometimes it's questions that they might have, and then also trying to plug them in to some of the other events that we do. Right. So like one of the things that we do with City of Knowledge is we really emphasize a lot of youth events. And we had this thing called Coffee with Sheikh. And it was basically a short talk and then mostly socialization, with obviously coffee. Yeah. I think that goes without saying. But so we try to plug them into some of these other events so that they can see that it's not like them trying to practice their faith on their own.
Right.
There's like a whole group of other people who also might have the same struggles as you, but when you're in a bigger group, you feel like, well, I have a sense of belonging here. Like this is my community. I can be with these people. So that's kind of the steps that we try to take.
You mentioned that there are knots in their head and you're performing surgery. And that's how you described it. A very nice way to describe it. We have a term, we say 40-day Muslims, the Muslims that they practice during the 30 months of Shahr Ramadan and then Ashura for 10 days. And that's when you'll see people they're more open to sit down and listen to lectures. So when you're preparing for lectures in Shahr Ramadan and Ashura, what knots are you specifically trying to target, knowing that if you untie these knots, they're more likely to be closer to their faiths after the 30 days are over or after these 10 days were over?
Yeah, so if a person is practicing faith in that way, there's usually a reason for it. Okay, it's not just out of chance, and a lot of times it does go back to there being certain ties or knots rather in their religious understanding. So, for example, this person might be of the idea that, well, yeah, I'm Muslim, Islam is this, but Islam doesn't necessarily expect me to do all this extra stuff, right? Islam's just expecting me to be like a nice person, a fair person, a kind person. And these, of course, are all part of Islam. So then, that person's understanding, what that person might be having a little bit of a misunderstanding about is, well, this is part of Islam, and then there's a whole lot more that Islam brought to the table, right? So like this past Ashra, I had a lecture called "Is Islam Simple or Complex?" Right? Mainly for this particular purpose, because I've had tens of people come up to me and be like, "Why is Islam so complicated, anyways? Why is it so complex, anyways? Can't it just be simple? And we just we're nice to other people and everything like that." And I always say, well, if it was that simple, did God really need to send like his prophets and his imams and everything just to tell you to be a nice person? Like, shouldn't we do that on our own, right? Shouldn't we just be good people? So usually there's a tie there, a knot there, right? Something is there that is somewhat preventing this person, right? Or it might just be like, well, that's the family I grew up in, right? So then you have other talks to explain, no, like when the Ahl Bayt used to do things, right? They used to do things this way. Like religion was part of their everyday life, right? And so you give that person an opportunity to see Islam from the perspective of the Ahlul Bayt. And then it's up to them, if that's appealing to them and they're like, oh, so this is what Imam Hussein wants from me, right? Or this is what God wants from me. Then it's up to them to, make that decision and see if they want to, make changes to their lifestyle and so on and so forth. But a lot of the lectures, for me personally at least, is built around a person who is not necessarily in the masjid 24/7. Right. And I don't know, I've always felt like I just felt comfortable connecting with people of that sort.
Right.
And the reality is a lot of my own extended relatives might even fall under that category, right? So because of that, it never, I never saw that as like oh my God, such a terrible thing and all that kind of stuff. I did see it as, okay, well, let's see what is the cause of you practicing your faith like this, and then let's see, how can we address it and get it closer to the way Ahl Bayt wanted us to practice.
I see what you're saying. A knot that I've realized with a lot of people around me is, and I want you to address this for me.
Sure.
Is they're not close to their religion because God is out there to choke them in their sleep and to put them in hell at any wrong thing they do.
Yeah.
You know, that's how their parents told them, like, you can't do this because if you do it, God's going to choke you in your sleep, or you're going to hang from your hair in hell because you don't wear a scarf, or a billion of other things, but all come back to God wanting to hurt us at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So as a sheikh, can you explain to me, does God really want to hurt us like that?
Yeah. So obviously our approach is always like when you go back to Quran and Hadith, right? Quran and Hadith always talk about these concepts around the mercy of God and how compassionate He is and so on and so forth. I think part of the reason why there's so many misunderstandings around this topic is because Islam's approach is very nuanced. I don't think it's that simple. And so, yes, there are expectations that the faith has of us. And the expectation is that you're going to act on these. And if there is someone who's just completely like giving himself a green light to do whatever he wants and like he has no barriers at all, well then yes, should this person worry about some of the consequences of what they're doing? Sure, right? But I don't think most people fall under that category. I think most people fall under the category of, for the most part, they do have barriers to a lot of things. Like if you're a Muslim, for the most part, there's certain things that are either always off the table or for the most part, they're off the table. Mm-hmm. Like you try not to do them. And I think one of the biggest misunderstandings people have is that God expects you and I to be perfect. Whereas when you go and look into the verses of the Quran, He's expecting you to try. And that's, I think, the biggest difference. Like, God understands we make mistakes. God understands that we might have shortcomings in some areas or sometimes many areas, right? The most important thing is for me to try and take responsibility and be like, this is something I was supposed to do and I'm lacking in it, right? So I always say we should never try to lower the faith to where we are. We should try to elevate ourselves to the standards of the faith. So if I'm lacking in a certain area, let me just tell God, like, I know I'm lacking in this area. I'm trying. And, you know, with your help, I'll hopefully be able to do it.
Yeah.
You know? Having said that, the way God judges on the Day of Judgment is quite complicated. There's hundreds of factors that God takes into consideration. It's not as simple as we make it out to be because we don't have that knowledge. So for us, it's like, oh, if you did this, you're fine. If you didn't do this, you're going to go to hell. It's not like that at all. Yes, are there consequences for deeds? Sure, there's no doubt about that. But the final judgment is something that hundreds of different factors are taken into consideration for, right? So I think Islam has kept that final judgment a bit vague on purpose so that the one who has no barriers at all doesn't feel like, hey, I can do whatever I want, right? Like we don't believe in this idea of just believe and you're saved, right? We don't believe in that, right? There is action that's expected of you. And then at the same time, it's vague in the sense of, well, if I messed up on certain things, does that mean I'm definitely going to end up here? No, there's actually quite a bit of hope for you, right? So I think Islam it keeps us between khawf and raja, as they say. And then, you know, I don't want to go into like that lecture that I did on this topic. So, you know,
they
for
can
those
check it
who
out on the internet.
Yeah, they can just look up, I think it was titled, Is It Difficult to Make It Into Heaven?
Yeah.
And when you look into narrations and verses of Quran in terms of how many ways God forgives your sins, some of the stuff that we just do normally, it's not like stuff we don't even like put effort into even. And all of a sudden your sins are forgiven, right? So for the one who's struggling with certain things, first of all, if he takes responsibility, God's mercy is there. Okay. Even if he is lacking, there's still so many other ways God catches you on the way. So I always say in that lecture, I said, like, the only thing that's left is for God to tie your hands and throw you into heaven. And he can't do that because you're a human being and you have free will. So you have to make an effort, right? So I think the most important thing is to try. And if we ever get to this point, you know, if anyone's listening to this and they're ever at a point in their life where they feel like, oh man, like I've messed up so much, I've done this, I've done that. The most important thing to always remember is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just wants you to recognize that you're a servant and that take responsibility for what you did. I messed up, and I'm going to try not to do this. So the Quran says, وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ, and the one who fears the status of his Lord, وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَى, and he forbids his soul or his ego from doing wrong things. Okay, so if you forbid yourself from doing wrong things, that doesn't mean you're not going to ever do them. But it means you have a little bit of sense of accountability of, this is not good. I should try.
Right.
So that trying is essentially what God expects
Right.
from us. Yeah.
Another thing is these people that mess up get looked down on by the religious community.
Sure.
Because you did this and now I'm not really trying to talk to you.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of push you away. And no, you're with like this other, I mean, it's a mistake. I did a mistake,
Sure.
but no, we a lot of people look down on people that mess up. And then those people that just slipped up and
Yeah.
made a mistake look and be like, if that person is religious and they're treating me this way, I don't even want to be religious anymore. So I'm just going to go in the other direction.
So I always say, don't allow someone else's mistake to negatively affect the relationship that you have with God. So, like, if you show up on the day of judgment and God's like, hey, like, what happened to our relationship, And you're like, oh, well, this person judged me. I would assume, this is not a hadith or anything, but I would assume God would be like, what does that have to do with me? So that guy's judgmental, but I'm merciful. So you had some shortcomings. Okay, so why didn't you just like take responsibility for them and say, well, I'm lacking in these areas, but I'm trying, right? So yes, is it a reality that in almost every community, there's always a portion, I don't think it's the majority of people, but there's always a portion of the community who does have this approach, right? Sometimes because they have the wrong intentions and, there's deeper illnesses happening inside their heart. Sometimes just pure ignorance, meaning they feel like this is the way to stop sinning, okay? They feel like I'm supposed to do this. Otherwise, how am I letting this person know that what they did was wrong, right? So it's for different reasons. Is that part of our community? 100%. There's no doubt about that. Will it always be a part of our community? 100%. That's the reality of it.
That's true.
Like, you'll never come across a community where when you walk in, nobody's thinking anything wrong about anybody. Nobody's backbiting about anybody, Unfortunately, these are the realities of life, right? Even if you go outside of the religious realm, you'll see it's the same thing in a lot of other ways, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're at work, there's people who do things at work too in your career, and you put in work, someone comes and takes credit for it, and that stuff happens, But of course, you and I don't expect it in a religious setting, so that's completely understandable. But my point was, what's happening is definitely wrong. And a lot of lectures and a lot of talks, we try to address it. So that's that. But I always think someone shouldn't allow that to affect the relationship that they have with God, right? So your relationship with God is dear, it's special. And if there are people who, out of ignorance or whatever, judge you for what you've done, then it is what it is. What they're doing is wrong. There's no doubt about it. But don't let that affect, your situation. And then, like you said, a lot of times this person made one mistake, felt the judgment, and then they're just like, forget about it.
Yeah.
I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. So if that person who's judging you is doing things for the wrong reasons, in some ways, if I do this and just walk away from faith, then it might show that my heart wasn't really with God from before either. I was just mainly concerned about my own pleasing myself, right? And my own well-being and like what feels good to me. So we have to remember, we're servants of God. We have a relationship with Him. Yes, if someone else does it, this is part of my tests.
Yeah.
There's a very beautiful hadith on this topic, right? So Musa alayhi salam, one time he is speaking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he's like, oh Allah, I have this problem. You know, of course, I'm like rewording the hadith. I have this problem. I don't know what to do. I need you to help me with it. And the call comes back like, yes, my servant, what is it? And Musa says, well, my situation is I've been kind to people, right? But people speak negatively of me, and they criticize me, and they're harsh with me, and so on and so forth, right? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls back to Musa and says, Musa, I will not remove from you a difficulty or a situation that I deal with myself.
Wow.
Right? In other words, of course, it's not difficult for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but
it's something that
something that applies to him too, because he's so kind to us all the time. And then we sit and we're like, oh yeah, this God, he doesn't look out for me, you know, look at my life.
He's not answering my prayers.
He's not answering my prayers, all this kind of stuff, right? Yeah. So the narration says, oh Musa, this is your test. Wouldn't it be better for you and more pleasing for you to walk in my footsteps? Because I'm God, and still people speak negatively of me, you know? So this is part of the test of life.
That's just how it is. I want to kind of shift a little bit and end with this topic, and it's people that are using substances like drugs and all this stuff that we don't talk about, that ends in suicide, depression, all of this stuff.
Yeah.
I spoke with individuals about this, and they kept referring to, we need more religious figures to talk about this stuff because these people don't want to show their faces. I don't want to come to the Sheikhs. I'm depressed because there's another notion of, you're depressed, go read Quran and you won't be depressed anymore. And obviously that doesn't work like that. So what can we do for these people to probably help them out?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, obviously, like you said, taking just the religious route on these issues is not helpful. Can it be helpful to a certain extent, or from particular aspects? Sure. You know, at the end of the day, there are teachings in Islam, like dua, for example. Are they helpful for a person who's in any difficulty? Sure, absolutely. You know, there's no doubt about that. But that's probably one of the many things that this person is in need of. So I think, you know, this is something that needs to happen, is like people need to have the ability, a little bit has to do with the scholar in the community, where they have to open that avenue where a person would even feel comfortable, you know, coming. And then at the same time, I think the community needs to set up avenues for this person getting help from professionals. So as a sheikh, I've been in that position multiple times, right?
With depression or like
both,
substance use? Okay.
Both, right? Sometimes suicidal thoughts, so on and so forth, right? So you might try to provide advice to this person, right? And share some fundamental, basic Islamic principles, right? But I'm not an expert in the field of, you know, psychology and mental health and so on and so forth, right? You might do some basic certificate programs here and there just to have some familiarity. And I've done some of those, but it doesn't make you an expert. Right. In fact, the first thing they teach you in those certificates is, don't you ever diagnose anyone, right? Yeah. And rightfully so, because you're not an expert in that field. So what we also need in our communities are avenues or options where this person is getting help not just from the sheikh, but from a professional as well. And then, yes, depending on what the situation is, sometimes the religious aspect might be a little bit more helpful. When I say the religious aspect, I'm not talking so much about recite this or that, but like talking to someone, right? Like we call it like spiritual counseling.
Okay.
Basically,
what
right?
does that entail?
Like basically talking about the difficulties that they're going through, right?
Okay.
Sometimes people go through difficulties, they feel like God is punishing them, right? So you have a conversation about that. Sometimes they're struggling with how they deal with their parents, And so these all have religious aspects to them, right?
Yes.
So there's that.
Having
and,
like abusive parents?
yeah, like abusive parents, or maybe just parents who are very like harsh, right?
Okay.
Or their parents, or like relatives, for example, or the type of friends they're hanging out with, and so on and so forth. So between these two, the point being, you need both. You can't just take one approach and say, oh, well, recite this dhikr and then you'll be fine. Like, that's not even what Islam taught us. Like, when your hand breaks,
Yeah.
if you want to recite Surah Al-Fatiha on your hand, sure, that's part of the process of shifa, right? We have narration saying Surah Al-Fatiha is recommended for shifa. Okay, great. Do it. But then you also have to go to the hospital and get it done, right? So same thing here. So you need both aspects. I think what we need a little bit more in our communities from the religious side is just recognition and opening the conversation and starting the conversation to remove that stigma a little bit so that this person feels comfortable enough
To walk into the mosque and tell you, hey, Sheikh, I'm dealing with this, this, and that.
and things of that nature. Now, I think for the most part, personally, just the way I do things, I feel like people might be comfortable enough to just come up to me as they have in the past multiple times, you know. But the community as well. Like, the community needs to have that conversation around, these are real things, they are happening, and if someone comes forward, they need to be admired for you had the courage to acknowledge this difficulty you're going through, and you're taking the steps to see what you can do to heal and so on and so forth, versus, oh yeah, that guy's weird, you know, or this person's like this, or, oh, I heard, you know, they do this like that. And
it's literally the judgmental factor that we were talking about. We have to remove it and replace it with something else. Well, when someone walks in, I'm just curious, when someone walks in with suicidal thoughts, and to get to a point where you're suicidal, we call it a sin because you're losing hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, correct? When they're talking to you about they're thinking about ending their life, how do you approach them and bringing them back? Because they're very far ahead on the losing hope spectrum. How do you bring them back?
So first of all, when someone comes in with these types of situations, first thing is to get a mental health professional involved. Okay. Right? Because I'm not an expert in any of these fields, and I don't give myself permission to act like I am. And it's a very dangerous thing, right? Sometimes a person like this, sometimes one little nudge and then they might end up hurting themselves or whatever they get. So first thing always is to get a mental health professional involved. That's number one thing that we do. But if you're talking mainly on the religious side of things, of like, you know, bringing them back faith-wise, it really just depends on sitting down with them and seeing where exactly is it that they feel like, you know, where is it that their thought process has moved in that direction. And it could be for a lot of different reasons. Like, sometimes it might be a breakup, for example, right? And this person has suicidal thoughts. Sometimes it might be just the pressure they're going through. Sometimes it might be because of the sexual preference that they felt growing up, right? And so it's very difficult for them. It's all sorts of situations.
Have you seen that, the sexual preference?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's something that in our communities, wherever you go across North America, is already there. And, you know, the denial that our communities had about this topic, or a lot of other topics, it just doesn't work, you know? And so we need to understand that this is a struggle that many of our brothers and sisters have. And, you know, when I say many, I don't mean like, you know, high percentages, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah. We have to allow them to talk. And
yeah, absolutely. You know, especially if it's a person who's still caring enough to want to practice their faith.
Right.
Like, society is a free society. You can live however you want to live, right? But if someone comes to me and says, I'm struggling with this, and at the same time, I still want to practice my faith, then I have to try my best to, you know, have that conversation and see where is it exactly that I can be of help. Again, maybe sometimes situations, only 10% of it has a religious aspect to it. 90% of it is a mental health professional.
Correct.
Sometimes it's vice versa. It just depends from situation to
So
situation.
basically what you're saying is let's say mosque is a stop on the recovery journey, not the stop.
Yeah, exactly. So the mosque needs to be, connected with other professionals who, when these issues come up, the mosque can essentially point this person in the direction of these other professionals.
Okay.
And then, yes, the alim would be there to, help on the religious side. Again, however much of those knots are religious knots.
Right.
Sometimes a lot of them are, sometimes very, very little. It just depends, right? Someone who might just be fundamentally dealing with depression, maybe 90% of his problem has nothing to do with religion, right? It's just a condition that this person is going through. And then there's other issues where, like family issues, for example, a lot of it actually has to do with the religious side, and you still need the professional side of it. So it's usually a mix of both, and just talking to the person and trying to get a better understanding of what they're going through will typically give you an idea of how much of a role you're going to play in it and how much the professional is going to play in it. And ideally, they are somewhat in touch.
Thank you, Sheikh Mahdi.
No
I appreciate
worries.
your time.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.